be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. Because our future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. We have with us today
Phoenix Godwin,
Albert Strickland,
and I'm Barbara Humphrey. Today we're going to be and Savannah Patterson on the board.
Hello.
On our last show, we introduced a somewhat radical idea to abolish prisons. We presented a fact-filled case that might have gotten an A if it were a history lecture. However, it's a radio show, not a history lecture. And we fear that we may have bored you. It may have been tedious, too academic. Perhaps a better use of our hour on the air would be a conversation to talk through the ideas with stories and experiences backed up by facts posted on our Facebook page, if we can figure out how to post them on our Facebook page.
We're working on it.
Yes, we are working on it. And so today we acknowledge that a major feeder of the prison industrial complex is poverty caused by capitalism. Today is also, at least this week, a very important anniversary that Albert and Phoenix are going to go talking about.
The anniversary of Occupy Savannah, and I'm sitting here with one of the founders of the Occupy Savannah movement, which is Phoenix Godwin. So,
hey, what's up?
We met before. I think it was October 9th that we first met.
What year was that again?
2012. 11, sorry. 2011.
So that's how long we've been friends now.
Yeah. 6 years.
Celebrating your 6-year anniversry of friendship.
That's right. I didn't get a present either.
Oh.
Or a cake or anything.
I'm messing up on that a lot.
I know.
Lately.
I know.
Apparently you didn't supply one either in Phoenix's defense.
No, I didn't. That's for sure. All right, so say something briefly about Occupy Savannah, why, and how it even relates to what we're talking about today.
Oh, sure. I think the most important thing that can be said about Occupy is probably that it joined a lot of would-be activists together, and like you and I, for example, we probably wouldn't be here doing this show right now if it weren't for Occupy.
Oh.
And there's a lot of work that we've done and other people that we know all over the world are doing, and that's a huge part of it is because Occupy introduced the younger generation to activism and introduced them to the older generation of activism and really got people together to start actually focusing on some of these issues, even though it might not have totally revolutionized the world like we were hoping. I think that's pretty much par for the course in history. We never really have that one moment of like giant world revolution where we've actually fixed all the problems. So,
but we keep trying. I remember the 60s. We were under the same
That's right.
illusion, you might say. We tried very desperately, and we did change a lot of things. It just didn't evolve the way we wanted it to. And I'm sure the same is true with Occupy, but Occupy is still alive. The people that were there are still very much the mindset and everything, and they know the problems that we face, and they are active in their areas.
And I often think that when we learn history, of course, we read it in the books. And as we've been learning more and more these days, what we read in the books isn't necessarily how things happened. So you think about the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille. My guess is there were probably months and years that went into that event that got put down in history as the signature event. And the people who spent the months and years building up to that probably agonized just the way we are.
And then years afterwards, still agonizing, like, we were supposed to be past all these problems, and now we have an aristocracy all over again.
But to all you capitalists out there, I want to remind you, your day is coming.
Your day is coming. And if we make you uncomfortable, if we make you squirm, then we have done our job.
Amen.
Amen. So last week, we started with a quote from Angela Davis, whose book, Are Prisons Obsolete?, introduced us to prison abolition.
And everyone should read that book.
Absolutely.
Please read the book.
Please.
It's pretty
well worth
short,
reading.
actually.
And we started with a quote that when we reread it, when we were planning this show, we realized was incredibly relevant today. Would you like to read it?
Sure. It says, the quote is, "Prison relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially those produced by racism and increasingly global capitalism."
Yes. So as we talk about global capitalism, as we talk about capitalism, not specifically global, but sure it is, we should think about prisons and how they grew and why they grew, and if we're going to abolish them, how we absolutely have to abolish poverty, abolish capitalism.
I think one of the things about prisons, because when we were raised, it was the rest of the world that was bad. It was the rest of the world that did everything. And to realize that the United States is the number one incarcerator of people in the world is kind of an amazing statistic when it's all those other guys, the bad guys that did all the bad things.
The
But now we
gulags
realize
and all those horrible
That's right.
places. Yeah.
But our prisons sometimes are worse than the gulags.
That's right.
So.
And we did talk last week about asking the questions, are prisons obsolete and serve no purpose? And in fact, you know, we thought that prisons were a place where someone would go to be rehabilitated and enter back into society, but we realized that's not the case.
It's the opposite.
No.
It's a holding pen.
It's a holding bin, and it makes things worse very often when you put people in solitary, abuse them. Crime has become the partner, punishment has become the partner of crime. Crime and punishment, we hear together.
Well, one thing in Savannah's always talking about the crime problem. I mean, Savannah has a terrific crime problem. Everybody's afraid to walk certain areas or certain streets. But there was a quote by a man some 20, I didn't look at the dates yet, 2,300 years ago, named Aristotle, I think.
Oh.
Yeah, him, that guy. And it was that poverty is the mother of revolution and crime.
That's right.
Poverty, the revolution and crime. We have the crime. We're now waiting on the revolution.
Yes, we are. And in the meantime, we will talk about how poverty and its partner crime lead to, you know, the prison pipeline, the poverty prison pipeline. And, you know, as Albert said, we are the largest incarcerators in the world. It seems like that's what we have used, as Angela Davis said, to solve our problems, to put them out of the way, out of sight, out of mind. And we also talked last week about how capitalism has turned our prisons and our prisoners into profit. It started out with prisoners in their prisons doing work for the state and then occasionally work for private companies. They
Right,
made
those
license plates
that they used to make. Yeah.
And
now it's Victoria's Secret that they're making. So.
That's right. Well, and yes, and in New York they were making furniture for state schools and
And
universities.
some of them are still picking cotton in fields.
That's right.
That's
Especially
right.
in Texas.
That's
I
right.
understand, yeah.
And it's
And
even,
they don't get paid anything. Just like the old days
Right.
when they had to pick cotton and didn't get paid.
Right.
And you can't say, I'm not going to do it. So.
Right. It's become the 21st century slavery.
Plantation.
And legal, because even though the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, it allows slavery to continue as a punishment for crime. And really, capitalism and privatization have taken a step even beyond making goods and providing services for private companies at no cost to them, because prison laborers are not getting paid. But now we see corporations moving into the prison business. They build the prisons, they operate the prisons, and more recently, they are actually moving into the ownership of prisons.
And lobbying Congress to make it a law that these prisons have to be held. It's like the hotels, you know.
That's
They have
right.
to have so many rooms in order to make a profit.
Right.
So they have to have so many cells that are filled in order to make a profit. So they actually make a deal with the state that those things have to be filled up to a certain level.
That's right. And private companies run the detention centers that more and more undocumented people are finding themselves in. And we learned about the congressional mandate
That's
to fill, I think it was, 34,000 beds, because that's how much money was being allocated for these centers.
Now, Phoenix, what is the definition of capitalism?
The
Since
definition
he has a good one.
The definition of capitalism, well, it's not mine, but it's when the means of production, or in other words, like the ways that you create resources or commodities or general things, when the means of production are owned and operated privately for the pursuit of profit. So anything that's being made, particularly in our industrial world, all of these things are all owned privately and operated specifically for profit.
So essentially, like slaves of old days, prisoners have become a commodity
They have
to make a
become
profit.
commodity. That's
Yes.
right. And the beauty is they cost the corporations nothing. They are on the balance sheet. The cost of production is low because the prisoners are providing the labor. So when we talked about reform versus abolition of the prison system, we talked a little bit about reform. We recognize that, good-hearted people, for the best of reasons, have been trying to reform the prisons for years. And sometimes those reforms have produced negative unintended consequences. And one in particular, when, states abolished capital punishment, what typically replaced it was life sentences. So it was so humane to stop executing people, but then you put them in those horrible, inhumane places for the rest of their lives. And we also recognize that reform doesn't fix a broken system. It simply puts a patch on it. The system still remains a faulty, flawed system. And in the case of the prisons, putting a Band-Aid on a broken system is not the answer.
No, and the things that I like to go back to is the prisons themselves don't rehabilitate. So the prisoners who do get out of prison at a certain amount of time re-enter society, but they re-enter this society without the rehabilitation they need.
Right.
In fact, they come out sometimes worse than they ever went
That's
in
right.
because they're not given an education, they're not giving a way to make amends to society and feel a part of society again. In fact, they're punished even after they get out of
That's
society.
right. They have this
out of
horrible
prison.
black
So-
mark when you
Right.
fill out a job application. And even in the places that have banned the box, where you don't have to put on the initial application that you've been convicted of a felony, at the point where you might be offered a job, the potential employer does have the right to look into your background and find out. And many people at that point then are excluded from work.
Even bus boys or
That's right.
bussers.
That's
okay.
right.
I'm sorry, I'm a little older.
Bus women,
Yeah, bus people.
And for any listeners that might not know that, the word for the sort of repeated entry that we have into the prison system is recidivism. When we have people that have been in the system, it gets harder to get out, and people are more likely to go back in.
that's right. That's absolutely true.
Now, since capitalism thrives with class,
Yes.
what class generally is probably 95% of the prisoners? Actually, probably far more than that,
Well,
if you were looking at
it's definitely the lower economic class. Like you said, poverty is one of the feeders of
That's right.
that.
That's right.
A lot of times people who have money get away with the same crimes that other people who don't have money don't get away with.
Remember the kid that
Yes.
was too rich to be
Right, in
put in
prison.
jail?
And in fact, yesterday,
There's
or
a
the
few.
day before,
There's a few, yeah.
the day before yesterday was the anniversary of the charges that were brought against Spiro Agnew.
Oh,
who
yeah.
Many of you, that might not be a name that's familiar to. He was governor
Phoenix,
of
do you know who
Maryland.
Spiro Agnew
I know.
was?
Yeah, that was Richard Nixon's vice president.
Yes, very good. And he was.
There is hope.
He had charges of
Fraud,
fraud,
and,
yeah, a lot of-
bribery, all kinds
right,
of things.
Right,
I
a
think
lot of
probably, 'cause I
charges
don't
brought up
remember
on
all of
him.
them,
He finally agreed to plead guilty to tax evasion.
Spiro
And I-
Agnew did?
Yes,
Yeah.
and
Oh.
I think he was given, a fine, but a suspended sentence. So for that crime, there was no imprisonment. Yet George Jackson, who stole, I think it was, $10 worth or $20 worth of goods
don't
from a
remember.
convenience store, was given a
70 or
sentence of
something
1
like
year to life, which became life. And that's not unusual. That's really what happens. So Angela Davis did give us a nice roadmap for how to begin the process of abolishing our prison system.
So how do we do that? How do we begin this abolition process?
That is a wonderful question. We think that caging people makes us safe, but in fact, we should know by now, we've been caging them for 200 years or so, that it doesn't make us any safer. So one of the things she's talked about is food, shelter, and freedom make communities safe, not prisons. So if a person has their needs met, if they feel hope in their life, they're much less likely to commit a crime and much less likely to become somebody who makes our communities unsafe.
And then those crimes are the white-collar crimes if they're committed because they want more. But the people who have enough, especially those from poverty, the blue-collar.
That's actually something, too, worth bringing up is the sort of cultural impetus involved here where we have a lot of commercials and media which portrays this concept of affluence or of having material wealth as being something that everybody should aspire to, and not only that everybody should be able to attain. And when people feel frustrated by not having these things that they're seeing and these things that are being portrayed as normal and they don't have access to it, this causes people to sometimes act drastically in order to get what they see as normal.
Yes, or act out of frustration.
Sure, yeah.
And so she talked about using the concept of abolition as a tool and a long-term goal. And I'm hoping that by introducing it to people who are listening, and the more you think about it, the more you realize that it's not such a radical idea, but certainly something we should be working toward. And one of the things that she talked about was if you're going to abolish the prisons, you need to abolish the pipelines of people into the prisons. And certainly, we've just mentioned poverty, which is what we're going to talk about today. We also realize that the war on drugs is a great driver of the prison population, a big one. More than a quarter of the people in prison right now are there on drug charges. Our broken immigration system is filling the detention centers. The militarized police and surveillance, and Phoenix can certainly talk to that.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Prisonization and privatization of our schools and our privatized, unhealthy healthcare system, because we did also learn that there's more people with mental illnesses in our prisons than in places to care for those people.
Into the hospitals where they can get care. They're put into a prison system where they're treated like an animal,
right,
and not given care at all. And we remember how this works because what was it? My mind isn't working totally. The experiment.
Oh, the Stanford
experiment.
University. Yes,
where they took a number of students, and I think it was 18, and they divided them 9 and 9. Some were guards and some were prisoners, and everyone chose to be a prisoner. Well, you can't have that, so they had to make some of them guards.
Right.
And there was this whole attitude change in these people over a period of time. The guards became vicious. They became
absolutely abusing.
It was they had to shut it down in 6 days for the safety. People were ready to be killed in this experiment. So it's a certain type of person that becomes a security guard or a guard.
Or more specifically, turning into a security guard or a policeman. It changes you. It transforms you psychologically because you're given power over others.
I told Barbara, I know this from experience. You give a person a gun and a badge, and they change.
They change.
It really happens.
Right.
I know.
Yeah,
they did that to me too. So.
Yes, we will take. That's right. We will take your word for that. And so now we get to capitalism, and we already started talking about what capitalism is, and we actually went back and forth with this a lot as we were creating the definition, because it is so many things and so many different things to different people. And Phoenix, you started out with a great definition when you talked about privatization about the means of production, and then the commodification, the privatization of the market, so that things are not provided to people based upon their need and ability to obtain them, but what the market will bear. So you could take a pair of Nike sneakers offshore the production, cost about $10, $15 perhaps to make them, but because you have built up such a demand for them, you can sell them for hundreds of dollars. So it has nothing to do with need, and it has nothing to do with actual cost of production. And we know
The
where...
one key word behind capitalism is just, it's a 5-letter word? Greed.
Oh, I was thinking of profit. Yes,
Well, greed. I mean,
Yeah,
they have
that's even better.
Profit to survive or profit to grow is not enough.
Right.
You have to get more. And you're in competition, which is also taught as a great thing in the American value system. It is not that great.
That's right.
Working together with people, now that's society.
Right.
When you're in competition with everyone around you, you're outside the bounds of reason, as far as I'm concerned.
For me, I think it's really... a lot of people will talk about capitalism and try to distinguish like these concepts and say like, oh, we're not living in capitalism today. This is crony capitalism, or this is corporate capitalism, or they try to add some addendum of why this isn't the great version of capitalism that we could actually have if only it were left to its own devices. But that is not the definition of capitalism. Refers to a concept of living which we've been practicing well before we had a name for it.
That's right.
We've been having and these problems that Angela Davis brings up, saying that we're doing away with these problems that are coming from our society by just putting them in prison. These are problems that have existed ever since there was the concept of law, since there was the concept of having private ownership. These are things which, like, since there's been private ownership, there's been thieves.
That's right. That's right. And I mean, one of the hallmarks of capitalism is that it's a class system. And you have the haves and have-nots, the 1%, the 99%. There's a lot of different ways. The capitalists and the working class, the rich and the not rich. There's all sorts of ways to describe that class system.
Well, this is one of the facets that fascinated me about Occupy, was that it did bring that out to a lot of people, the fact that there is this inequality, this wealth gap.
That's right.
People have billions in the bank while people are starving just down the street. And in any system, that would be a failure in my book. But for them to, what did we say earlier today, that the have-nots want to be someday the haves, so
The
they
wannabes. The
the
wannabes.
wannabes.
Yeah, a lot
they
of
think
people-
everybody can make it.
A lot of people consider themselves, there's a phrase, they consider themselves to be temporarily embarrassed millionaires. So the people
I
that
love
don't
that.
have money
Right.
feel like it's
Right.
just something they got to get through, and eventually they will. It's not a fault of the system, it's a fault of their own, and it's a fault of everybody who hasn't made it, even though there's no possible way under the capitalist system for everybody to be in the same economic class.
That's right. And some of us were brought
Because
up...
it depends upon that lower class.
That's right.
In order to profit.
To prop it up. And some of us were brought up with the Horatio Alger story. Anyone can be a millionaire. Even you can be a millionaire. You work hard, and you will achieve that goal. And when you're brought up with that, it's really hard to, turn your head around and say, wait a minute. Look
There's not
around.
enough money here for
There's-
everybody to be
well,
millionaires.
even if there was enough money, I mean, it's like the lottery. Not everybody is going to win. And
it's called
certainly-
survivor's bias. When they've got like if you go to China and you look at all the buildings that are there, you might think that these are how, like some of these old buildings, that's always how things were built over that time. But really what we see are the ones that lasted that
That's
long,
right.
that made it through all of the different design choices.
Right.
So survivor's bias is what people have when they feel like, well, some people have made it or I've made it, so therefore you should be able to as well.
That's right.
Pull
That's
yourself up by your own bootstraps.
That's right. That's right. So get those boots on, people.
I'm wearing boots, but it hasn't worked for me yet.
The other thing we talked about, and I know we have not really come to 100% agreement. I was always brought up to consider capitalism to be a way of organizing your economy, your economic system, and it was not a political system. And yet, I have to admit that today there is such a thin line between capitalism and our political system, and it's almost as if they're one and the same. The capitalists become the government, the government, the people who are running the various departments in the government, and
Well, see,
then
that's
back
what I
and
was
forth.
brought up to believe, even in school. And
Yeah.
Nancy Pelosi recently echoed that. We are capitalists,
We are
she said.
capitalists, and capitalism is a major contributor to contested political races, and of course, there's an expectation of return on investment. I give to you, and I expect something back for it. And they've become, so intertwined. They're one and the same.
There is no standing political system right now which existed before the creation of the concept of capitalism. Like, once we actually named it, like, this was something which was enforced by bankers and stuff like that well before any current government was ever established. The current governments are all put there in place to protect the powerful, to keep the powerful powerful, keep the rich rich, and keep capitalism in place.
And one of the ironies of capitalism is, even though it's a privatized system, privatized production of goods and services, privatized market, capitalism relies on public infrastructure in order to operate. It's not the capitalists who are building the roads, the rails, the runways, and the ports. It's not the capitalists who have created the airwaves or have police and fire and courts that they fund for their use. They don't necessarily put in the water, sewer lines, utilities, communication, etc. So they rely on government to make it, to put this infrastructure in place so that they can produce.
More than that, I would say, because sometimes they rely on government, but sometimes they do it in spite of government. I think a more important thing is that they rely on people. And people are the ones doing the work. Capitalism and the corporations decide who gets paid to do the work and who actually benefits from it, as opposed to who does not benefit from it or who suffers from it.
That's right.
I love it when we talk about a new paradigm, a new system, and people say, "But who's going to build the roads?
Who's going to wash
and
the
I
dishes?"
But who's doing it now?
Who's
exactly.
doing it now?
Do you
That's
see the mayor out there building roads or the county chairman or any of this sort of thing? No, people are out there doing it. If we can do it with them in office, we can certainly do it without them
in office. I agree.
I won't go there.
Please don't go there. I mean, the other thing that and I think we already mentioned it, that capitalism is driven by one motive, and that is profit. And profit is the cost of production versus the profit, the money made from sales. So you have a profit when you bring in more money for sales than it costs you to produce, when it costs you to serve.
A part of this is, I remember some of the excessive parts of capitalism. A tire company will create a tire. They know this tire is bad. It's already been proven to them, but they will do it anyway, because all the lawsuits that will come out from the deaths or from the accidents that they will get will still be less than the profit.
Still keep the profit.
Because that's greed. But that type of greed is evil, which makes
absolutely
capitalism
evil.
An evil system.
And I'm going to mention one of my heroes, Ralph Nader. And I don't know if any of you remember, he got his start as a consumer advocate, unsafe at any speed. And he was writing about, was it the Corvair? That lovely car put out by General Motors. They knew it was unsafe when they put it out. But they put it out anyway, and
that's
people
the one that
died.
had the motor in, I think, sideways, wasn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure what it was.
I don't remember.
I was very glad I never owned one. But
I owned a Pinto.
You owned a Pinto. That was even worse.
But I loved it.
He did a few actually really kind of heroic campaigns about public safety against industries that, I mean, I don't really love bourgeois politicians, but he had some really nice things that he tried to help us out. In fact, Savannah itself was a place that benefited from him coming in to these factories in the Savannah River that were polluting a lot. And Ralph Nader and his group of people that he had came, and they basically blew up the story, and they made it really huge. And they were in Washington, D.C. trying to do everything they could to get these places regulated.
You
mean that river just over there? That's one of the
river?
Top polluted rivers in the nation.
Yeah,
still?
it's radioactive
Thanks to those
waste.
Capitalists.
I'm glad he came.
I'm glad he came too. I wish he had stayed.
Yeah. We might not need lights at night. We could all glow.
That's right.
Or we would just start to realize the problems with him too, and eventually fall out of favor.
So capitalists must make a profit. They need to attract investors in order to grow their enterprise, and they're not going to attract investors if they can't show a profit. They need to compete for resources and market share, and they also need to grow. And all those things take money, and that's money that's made from the sale of the goods and services they provide.
And also it takes some other things. It takes laws that are geared in their favor, which means they have to bribe a few congressmen or a few city officials or state officials to get the laws changed in their favor so they can make even more money.
That's true. So in order to maximize... Yes, go ahead.
Do you remember... you don't remember. Yeah, maybe we do.
Maybe
There was a time when the rich paid 90% tax rate.
I heard that.
Yeah,
When was that?
that was Eisenhower.
I must have been before I was born.
But no, I'm afraid not. But we were too young to be a part of it. Yes,
That's true. I mean, we weren't
But
rich.
they paid 90% tax rate, and that's when we really grew. We did a lot of things,
Mhm.
and now with them paying almost nothing, and with corporations offshoring, and most of their profits are offshored. Who picks up that?
Wait a second. That doesn't sound like trickle-down economics
Oh,
to me.
you know about trickle down.
Yeah, you know what's
There's only one thing
trickling
that
down.
trickles down, and it ain't economics.
That's right. So, think about it for a minute. I know none of us are economists or mathematicians, but it really isn't hard to realize that if you're going to maximize profit, you need to minimize your costs of production and sales. So what are your costs of production? Your workers, your natural resources, the capital you need to create your business, government regulations, and your site of manufacturing and marketing. So again, think about all of the costs of all of those things need to be minimized. So you need to obtain labor at the lowest cost. Okay, and with that, we will have to stop and identify who we are and why
I
we're
know
here.
who I am.
Well, good. I wish I did.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure
at
about
least one
you.
of us does.
Let me just tell you where we are, because you may not know that. We are WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. I want to tell you about the Skidaway Marine Science Day, which is coming up on Saturday, October 14th, from noon to 4 p.m., at 10 Ocean Science Circle on the north end of Skidaway Island. There are activities, tours, and more for children and adults. Admission is free. That doesn't sound like a capitalist enterprise to me. And for additional information, you can call 912-598-2600 or
2400.
2400. Sorry, you're right. These old eyes. Or www.skio.uga.edu. Let me give you this again. www.skio.uga.edu. Okay. And if you have any questions, send us a Facebook message and we'll get the information to you. Okay.
If your business enjoys our programming on WRUULP, please support the station with a donation. Let your customers, neighbors, and friends know that you share our vision of building a thriving community based on diverse, vibrant radio programming. As a business partner, our listeners will know you support Savannah's only broad-based community radio station. Become a tower sponsor or underwriter. To check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/business. Again, to check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/business. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUULP.
Okay, so I believe we're back on the air, and you are listening to Voices of Resistance, and I'm Barbara Humphrey,
I'm Albert Strickland.
I'm Phoenix Godwin.
and we have Savannah Patterson on the board. So thank you for staying with us through our identification and our sponsor messages to you. And I would like just simply to say that community radio is a very special thing, and to have a community radio station in your city is a pretty amazing thing to have. And if you can, it would be wonderful if you could support the station, listen, contribute. It's a really valuable resource. You won't find conversations like this on the capitalist airwaves.
No, because if you do, you won't be on the air very long.
That's right. That's right. In fact, I was talking to my son earlier, and she was extremely upset with even a show on Democracy Now! He was extremely upset yesterday, and I said, that even public radio has changed, because they now are getting sponsors, and some of their sponsors don't always have our best interest at heart.
Well, that's also part of our point here, is the fact that the people can do a lot
Yes.
when we get together and do
That's
things,
right.
and we don't
That's
need
right.
too much regulation or too much
Yeah.
control of the things. People respond well, and we can make things grow and do things
That's right.
for us.
That's right. Like tell you that if capitalists, businesses need to keep their cost of production low, and one of the ways is to pay their workers as little as possible, does it
No, they would
surprise
not
us
do
that
that now, right?
capitalism causes poverty?
Look at the current furor over increasing the wage.
Yes.
I mean, people are upset. They're making Georgia's 720. No, Georgia's
725.
525.
Yeah.
No,
Yes.
Georgia's
It's the
725.
federal.
They
That's
put
the
it up to
federal.
federal.
No,
okay.
that's the
Georgia's
federal level.
525, but they have to abide by the federal, so it's
Right.
725.
Wow.
But-
Nice job, Georgia.
It thinks if they didn't have the federal, where we'd be.
Right.
So and so when you think about this low wage, you're actually subsidizing someone that has billions in the bank
That's right.
with your labor and your. So when you even say something like, "Well, I'll take $10 an hour, or 11 or 12," you're cheating yourself.
That's right.
They're going home with billions. The one thing I've discovered that every night, people will go home and wake up in the morning more poor than they were the day before.
That's right.
Yet, billionaires will go home and wake up in the morning and they will be richer.
A lot of times they didn't even have to do a day of work.
What work do they do?
Exactly. and
I don't know. What do? They probably, maybe they're out on their yachts. Maybe
What was
they're
it? I don't know
traveling.
the
Oh,
exact.
that sounds grueling.
It
I
does.
know.
It's absolutely
You
hard
remember
work.
we were at Occupy. We had all these figures for these CEOs. One of them was like $9 million a year. I think it was McDonald's. And yet paying $15 an hour is too much to their employees. Now, without those employees, they would get nothing because they can't go and do the
That's
work.
right.
In fact, they
That's
don't. They
right.
probably never flipped a burger in their life.
That's
You know,
very
so-
true. Very true. So, so we can understand, and not only do capitalists make us poor by trying to keep the cost of labor as low as possible, they use their profits to provide political contributions to influence elected officials to enact laws and regulations favorable to their businesses in the areas of labor, environment, markets, etc., which often work against us.
Oh, that's actually something that's a sort of political economy that I wanted to bring up real quick, which is that when we talk about capitalism and making profits and stuff, this is not necessarily all in terms of money or currency.
That's right.
Currency has made it very easy to measure these things and be able to exploit people for profit because then we can put it into numbers. But it's not always about that. Sometimes it's about land ownership, or sometimes it's just about particular resources or even political favors
That's
that you
right.
could get.
That's right. And, one of the ways that corporations maximize their profits is by killing off their competition. And what happens when the competition gets killed off? People get laid off. People lose their jobs.
Also, innovation is stifled.
That's right. That's
I
right.
remember I lived in Seattle for a long time, and I really liked Starbucks coffee then. And there was this competition company in Seattle called Seattle's Best. Next thing I know, Starbucks bought Seattle's
That's
Best. So
right.
they're both products are still on the grocery
That's
shelves,
right.
but
And-
it's one company that owns them.
And so that we don't seem inconsistent, it's not that we're saying that that competition is the ideal here,
No.
but it is claimed that competition is supposed to be that which makes capitalism healthy. But what we see instead is that capitalism serves its own interest, and the rich try to make it so that they're not really competing at all. They're only just trying to get us to give them money and get rid of their own competition.
Yeah. So the other thing that capitalists do is get sweetheart deals from municipalities in order to come
Like
in.
Savannah.
And you can talk about Savannah, and I can talk about what goes on up north. Yeah.
Also, hotels here
Yeah.
everywhere.
Hotels.
Hotels are often a really big part of city government.
Yes.
These companies come in, and Savannah's, in order to attract business, to increase jobs, they spend all this money on land they buy, and then they grade it, and they say, come in
Yeah.
and take this. And we did this recently with some of the auto plants. I think one of them was Mercedes or something, and came in, wanted to show interest. So
Yeah.
Savannah bent over backwards, spent
Yep.
all this money to do something, put in all the necessities they would need, the sewer and the water lines and all that sort of thing. And then they said, no, we're not going to do
Then
it.
they never
So,
came.
No.
Yep.
And so, but they gave them sweetheart deals. I mean, they pay less per kilowatt hour than we do as a poor person, and they pay less for their water than
Right.
we do per
And the
glass,
other-
I
right.
guess, or whatever it is.
That's right. And the other thing corporations get is they're called payments in lieu of taxes, or pilots. And I'm sure you've all heard, this company comes to town and isn't it wonderful? But if they're paying less, you're paying more. because the bottom line doesn't change. In fact, sometimes the bottom line goes up because these companies need enhanced infrastructure.
Yeah, I'd never
Bigger
heard of the
roads.
pilot before, but I like that.
You like it? Okay.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah, well,
Also, one of our people on city council, right before they were on city council, they were president of First Chatham Bank. Just a little interesting tidbit about having your corporations involved with your city government. I'm sure that, though, then again, there's probably no conflicting interest there. Actually,
No.
I don't know what I'm
Absolutely
talking
not.
about.
No, couldn't be.
well, we can talk about it from a point of view that we do know about when we see what's happened between the relationship between Wall Street and Washington, with the CEOs of companies like Goldman Sachs becoming the head of the Treasury Department, and or some of the big ag corporations, their CEOs become Department of Interior, and we know that back and forth, and certainly there's influence there.
Well, I remember a certain politician not too many years ago that was running for office and said all the right things, made everyone up in arms, 100%.
Politicians do that?
Yeah, he said all the right words this time. I mean, he had people up in hope.
Was it change you could believe in?
That's it. And so anti-Wall Street, the whole thing, we've got to put things right. And next thing I know, I'm watching what he's doing. He goes in the White House and Goldman Sachs, Jamie Dimon with
Chase.
Chase,
Yeah,
and
Chase.
all Larry Summers, Geithner, all these people surrounded him.
Yes.
Now these were the people that were supposed to be. He was going to Elizabeth
Right.
Warren in place to.
That's right.
Curb
These
all
were the
the
people who tanked the
excesses.
economy in
Yeah,
2008.
That's right.
And then
now they're in
suddenly-
control of the government.
That's right. That's right. And that wonderful bailout. I mean, it's so nice when that happens, isn't it?
What was it? $700 billion.
Yeah, something like
Two of the
that.
companies which ran us into the ground.
Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely.
So we also know that capitalist economies distribute income to workers and owners of wealth, but it's not an equity distribution. It's not an equality distribution. And the people in society who don't work don't share in that distribution. And these are often children, elderly persons, persons with disabilities, students, the unemployed, generally the poorest people in society. And that's how capitalism works.
But then in poverty, it always not at their own fault.
Right,
So
of
it's
course
not because they want to be there.
Right.
It's because they have no way out.
They statistically can't.
Right.
Economic mobility is a thing worth researching about. Particularly the southeast coastal region of the United States. Savannah is particularly worse off, though, in what is a increasingly bad problem of economic mobility. And so, it's people in about the lowest third of our economic system, they statistically can't get out of it.
That's right. And if we were sitting in an auditorium right now, if we were doing a history lecture, I would ask you, everybody who who wants to be poor, please raise your hand. And I would be shocked if anybody did. I worked for city government during the Reagan years when everything was being outsourced and the private sector can do it better. And every year, you would look around and say, okay, who's going to lose their job now? And just the thought of losing your job and having to raise 2 kids as a single parent and be poor, I mean, it was a pretty horrifying.
Well, one thing I noticed is that those nasty Republicans did all these bad things, right? But when the Democrats went in, they didn't change any
No,
of those
some
bad
of them did
things
even
back
worse
to the
things.
good. That's right. They added to it, such
That's
as
right.
Clinton, for a good example.
That's right.
Glass-Steagall was a very
That's right.
dangerous thing that he did.
That's
But he did
right.
it.
By
NAFTA,
ending that.
all these things, yeah.
Yes, the trade agreements that helped us deindustrialize, a wonderful word.
So I have a theory now that Republicans and others they're all kind of nasty.
Wait, is it almost as if they're in the same economic class and maybe
Absolutely.
manipulating the rest of the people to
Imagine
serve them?
that. Yes.
You know the old thing-
Imagine that.
Wait, how
Someone-
much does it? I can't just. I'm broke. Can I go run for a Democratic Party and try to fix it and reform that system?
Very interesting question, because if I were standing in front of the 535 senators and congresspeople and said, okay, all of you who are poor, raise your hand. And I don't think I'd get too
In
many
fact,
hands
there's some
raised.
that have 300 million and more in there, and there are very few that are not millionaires, at least this day and age. Very, very few.
That's
And all of them
true.
are rich.
That's
But
true.
I have here, someone left, and I don't know why they left this. There's a quarter on the desk.
Ooh.
And I'm looking at it, and I'm seeing it has 2 sides, heads and tails. And I'm looking at it as Democrat and Republican. But all it is the same thing. It's a quarter.
That's right. Two sides of the same coin.
That's right.
And
That's my theory.
Nice metaphor, Albert.
yes, very nice
You
metaphor.
can beat me up later, but that's my
Thank you
theory.
for that quarter.
It's just sitting here. I don't know why.
Yeah. And, so I hope you're understanding how we are making the case on how capitalism does create poverty. And even though it held the promise, or at least in theory, of ending poverty, the absolute opposite has happened. More people have become poor than rich.
Look at the industrial areas that have been destroyed. We were watching something last night about Flint and Detroit and how the people really are destroyed. Poverty is rampant, of course.
That's
It is everywhere, not just there. But those cities were devastated.
Yes.
For all this.
That's right. And I came to Savannah from Syracuse, New York, which was totally devastated. When I moved there, we had thriving factories, including Carrier Corporation, running 3 shifts. And in fact, my first job was as a teacher. And as I would drive to school at 7:30 in the morning, there would be these bars on the corner, and they'd all be open. And I thought, oh my God, what kind of a place did I come to? What's going on here? And then people would say, well, it's a third shift. The people who work from midnight until 7:30, 8 o'clock, they get off work. That's their afternoon. And I thought, oh yeah, that's true. And these were people with great incomes. They were union. They owned houses. They raised families. These were good jobs.
Well, Georgia, I walked from Savannah to Selma
That's
2
right.
years ago. And so going through middle Georgia, it really opened my eyes because Georgia is devastated by the loss of business. We once had thriving furniture industry. We had a thriving carpet industry. We had a thriving textiles of all kinds. We had a great agricultural farms. People had farms. Now we have agribusiness.
Yep.
And all those places are devastated. All those
totally
the mills,
devastated.
Very, very few of it, very little of it left.
Yeah.
And these people were really suffering.
That's
and
right.
Then I stayed at I stayed at a nursery, and I stayed in a shed they had. The next morning they invited me over for coffee, and so I go. And the guy is sitting there, trying to pay his bills, and he owns this nursery that his family's had for 35, 40 years, but he's not being able to make it now because 20 miles down the road, Walmart opened this gigantic store and took everything. So now he's not even able to survive with this, or is barely surviving. And I mean barely.
I agree. And when I would spend 40-some years, my life in Syracuse, driving to Albany and back, because that was, of course, the state capital, so you were constantly going there, and you would go by Mohawk Carpet, Beechnut Baby Food, Gloversville, where they made very, very high-end gloves, and then to see all these industry gone. And my last trip, it broke my heart, because even though Beechnut had moved out from a little town called Canajoharie, the sign had stayed up, and it was just such an icon of a sign, and even that had come down, and the places are just devastated.
Well, I think we could actually relate this a little bit locally too, because we can. We haven't mentioned yet on today's show, although we should, that in poverty, in Savannah, 1 in 4 people are in poverty. Some neighborhoods, that's more than 50% actually. There's more than half the people in some neighborhoods are in poverty.
In fact, the neighborhood that we live in.
Yeah,
That's right.
and
That's right.
and yet, kind of like this Walmart thing where people put on this idea of success that will help out. We've got all these stores that are opening up on Broughton Street and things that are supposedly going to help out the economy that's here. We've had this poverty since the inception of Savannah, since it started. It's having class disparity has always been there, and somehow having more businesses is supposed to help. Well, here we are some years later after the development of Broughton Street, and the poverty rate has not changed at all. Yeah.
But look what we had happen. We had this rich guy come in, buy up all the downtown area basically, and what is he putting in? He's putting in
Gap.
Gap. Well, that was
money that does not stay here.
It doesn't.
Right. No, money that does not. I saw Loft, and I assume that's Ann Taylor Loft.
It is. And then Michael.
There's a
whatever.
Victoria's
Well,
Secret
we
there,
have
which some of it is made by
Right.
prison slaves.
And
That's
a
right.
Starbucks and a Panera's and, all the chains.
So
that
what does
come in.
Savannah get out of that except a little bit of the tax money
That's right.
and Some people get a minimum wage job,
And
or maybe a little better than a minimum
That's right.
wage. That's it.
And then, of course,
the
the irony
profits all
is,
go out to
right,
different.
and the
That was
irony
my
is-
problem with Whole Foods when they
Right.
came to town. Same thing.
Right, same thing, destroying the environment and
gentrifying.
gentrifying.
Gentrification.
So
Oh.
not just poverty, but the disparity, the wealth disparity. We know that poverty is increasing, but we also know that the disparity between the rich and the poor is growing. And it's easy in a way to understand that. If you've got money, money makes money. That's just the reality. If you have money, you can invest it. You can, there's things you can do with it. Poor people, it costs more to be poor than it does to be wealthy. If you're a poor person without a car, you shop at a local store. It's limited to what you can buy. Certainly, very rarely can you buy fresh fruits and vegetables. You're paying a much higher price for things. You're taking public transportation, and while I'm very thankful that it's there, if you had to make 2 or 3 round trips on a bus on a daily basis, it would cost you much more than the cost of owning a car.
And this is another thing for another day, but our bus system needs some serious work.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I've always ridden
And they
the
all
bus,
have,
but-
because, here's the reality. We've talked about the capitalists who own the politicians. And the politicians, there is money that's put into a trust fund for transportation. And over the years, less and less gets put into subsidizing public transportation and more into highways and roads.
Well, we've got 9 people. I like this analogy. This is my thing. We've got 9 people that are making decisions for 150,000 people, or roughly that area, and we have no real input. They say, all right, call your city councilman. Okay, I call my city council. I say, I don't want this done. You're the president and CEO of a major corporation. Who do you think they're going to listen to? Or who do you think is going to have the power to sway that politician? It's not going to be me.
But a
Who
hotel
are they
owner
listening
definitely
to?
does.
Yes,
Yeah.
hotels, and also
That's
some of
right.
the businesses around
That's
town,
right.
the big businesses.
That's
that
right.
Ben,
control a lot.
was it Ben Carter? Is that his name? The
Yeah.
guy who owns Broughton Street now, pretty much.
I don't think it's Ben Carter.
Or-
I don't know what his name is.
I'm too new to know anything.
I'm too old to know.
But I do know up north we had an aspiring congressman, and he came out to peace rallies. He came out to universal health care rallies. He was in the right places, and he talked the right game. He met with the Peace Council before he went off to Washington, and we were so optimistic. And he got a designation as the freshman congressman, his first 6 months in office, who had raised the most money. So this was what this was his claim to fame. When he came back to the district, he met with the CEO at Lockheed Martin, but he never came back to meet with the people at the Peace Council. So, we know where he raised his money, and he would say to me, well, as a freshman congressman, I've got to get a few elections under my belt before I have the autonomy to, and it was like,
Right.
yeah, there'll always be an excuse. There'll always be a reason.
Since we've got less than 10 minutes
Right.
left, I wanted to. You have on this thing about like whether capitalism can be reformed and what are alternatives
Yeah,
to capitalism. So we're not
we
just
do.
leaving people with this sort of like everything is horrible now, but it could be better. And some of the like one thing that I'm sure a lot of people are having a gut reaction to is saying, well, okay, what's the alternative? What are you going to say? It should be communism or socialism? And well, actually,
Tell us first, can it be reformed?
no.
I mean, that's
No,
what I
it
want-
depends. Like you said, it depends on there being a lower class. So there is no end to class struggle as long as there's capitalism.
It can never be reformed under any circumstances.
That's right.
It can
And
be tweaked a little bit to make the poor comfortable.
that's right. And the few times we have seen reforms, they can be taken away as easily as they're put into place. And we see that the watchdog agencies that are supposed to be out working for us, they're either staffed and headed by capitalists, or they're not given the money to do their job. The EPA is a perfect example.
And when we talk about alternatives,
Yes, let's
there
talk
could
about
be,
alternatives.
So I'm personally not a socialist. A socialist means that you have a state, and that state is in charge of the means of production, and so like actually technically the people are supposed to be in control of the state in a socialist society. We'll see however that works, but
But it hasn't worked so far, really.
it's
That's
worth
right.
pointing out, though, to a lot of people that have particular ideas about history that have been put out for the benefit of capitalists, especially. For example, the Soviet Union, when Lenin was in power, he specifically said, while we're trying to build towards a socialist and communist, and then eventually communist society, we will use state-based capitalism. They never got away from it because they were inside of a wartime economy,
right.
and so completely shifting their means of production, completely shifting their economy was not really possible. There are smaller socialist things, but I don't think that that's really the answer. I don't think if you have somebody in charge that you'll ever get rid of class struggle. If you want to get rid of class struggle and actually get rid of the problems of power where some people are kept at a lower caste, essentially, than everybody else, you have to get rid of that class struggle.
And they also created a giant bureaucracy, which
Yes.
basically
Right.
created an aristocracy again. While the people were in bread lines, they were well fed.
That's
And
right.
and this isn't to rag on socialism, but more to say that the solution comes in finding alternatives to depending on others. So, for example, we were talking about radical municipalism earlier. That's something that some of the Kurdish are using, I think especially in Rahaba. This is an idea by a old anarchist philosopher or libertarian socialist named Murray Bookchin. Their idea was basically another type of transitionary thing where you could coexist with the state, coexist with your nation while you're weaning off of your dependence on it. So you would have face-to-face meetings with people in your neighborhoods. Your neighborhoods are decided by the people who live there, not by some people in an office somewhere else that don't actually live where you live. It actually has to do with coming together as community members, getting the needs met for yourselves. And that's the sort of future that we have to start looking at and examining if we actually want to get away from the oppression that comes from class struggle.
Yes, yes. And are there other ways of organizing that we think could be alternatives to capitalism?
Well, it depends. We claim to be a democracy, but we're not.
Right.
We never have
Right.
been, and we can never really be. Democracy means people, and it doesn't mean this capitalist idea that we have. So, there are different ways. There's real democracy, where actually people do take control of their lives, and they realize that everything is held in common. That there is the commons, which is a very important concept, and it was actually a concept that was actually envisioned by many of the founders of this country, that it would be a commons. That never materialized because even they themselves were very rich, and the poor people never really amounted to much except cannon fodder.
Worth noting that James Oglethorpe founded this city specifically with the intention of having a classless agrarian society. His idea was that everybody could have a small piece of land that wouldn't be too big, so you couldn't monopolize it, and then you would no longer have class disparity. But he left within 10 years, considering it to be a failure.
Well, it was, because now we have all these squares that he created, which were supposed to be centers for activity, for people meeting, people gathering and discussing and talking about issues, and also food and all was supposed to be in these squares. Now they're just nice places to walk through with a bench, and they're not used for anything.
That you have to pay if you want to have a gathering.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. Albert and I were away when I think it was last weekend, and it was a group of people together, and they had a task to do, and they kind of got together and they planned it, and they divided up the tasks and kind of did it. And it's this concept of people living together in a way where there are no rulers on the top telling you what to do.
I got to build a shelf.
You got to build a shelf, yes,
because they needed one.
And Yeah.
So the next show we've got the event.
Yes, we want to tell you about a very important event on Sunday, October 15th at 7 p.m. A movie called Swing Kids will be shown at the Sentient Bean on the south end of Forsyth Park. And one of the things we recognized is that there are so many young people out there like Phoenix who are so anxious to get involved, and Savannah, who recognize, they see this looming threat in front of us and feel we need to stand up. We need to stand up now. If we wait, it'll be too late. And Swing Kids is a movie from the Nazi era.
Right.
And it really
about the Nazi era.
About the Nazi era. And it really reinforces that message that there are many ways you can stand up.
Especially as we see at this moment, it's on the rise again.
That's right.
And so
Especially
people really need to know what's happening and stand up.
this
So
moment.
this is a very important movie, so
That's
please.
Right. So next week, we are going to talk about another major feeder into the prison system, the war on drugs. This is a 40-plus-year-old, quote-unquote, war that has been as successful as most of the other wars we have
Like the
fought.
war on poverty?
People joke and say, if you want to abolish poverty, have a war on it because, or you want to abolish, because certainly it's put more drugs on the street.
The war on poverty increased poverty. The war on drugs
Increased drugs.
So
That's
they
right.
can feed the prisons.
And feed the prisons. So that is what we're going to talk about, and we look forward to having you as our listeners.
Sorry we didn't have more time to go
I
into
know.
more.
We never have enough time.
We really don't.
We are talking about doing podcasts where we would have more time to really discuss things and get those up on the web. We haven't gotten to that yet.
That's it.
That's it.